July 1st, 2013. The final welding machines at the Grand Blanc facility powered down, leaving a deafening silence across 1.6 million square feet of concrete. There were no ceremonies, no grand farewells, just a padlock on the gate of a factory that once saved the free world. 7 decades earlier, this exact ground was the beating heart of the arsenal of democracy. At the height of the Second World War, thousands of workers labored relentlessly to forge over 11,000 Sherman and Pershing tanks, turning the tide of global conflict. It was an unstoppable colossus of American manufacturing, providing generations of secure livelihoods. Today, the legendary assembly lines have been erased. From thousands of skilled jobs, the employment roster plummeted in a devastating freefall to absolute zero. A fortress built to defend a nation was ultimately leveled to the ground, replaced by a barren commercial parking lot. How does an industrial titan that survived World War II, the Cold War, and decades of economic turbulence simply vanish? It wasn't destroyed by foreign artillery or global enemies. It was quietly executed by its own parent company, dismantled by a single corporate mandate to optimize profit margins. Grand Blanc, Michigan, 1942 to 2013. This is the saga of an American manufacturing miracle, a story that reveals the brutal truth of what happens when a community's proudest legacy collides with the ruthless reality of a corporate balance sheet. In the final weeks of 1941, the wind howling across the rolling plains of Genesee County, Michigan, carried nothing but the biting cold of an approaching winter. Grand Blanc was a quiet, unassuming agricultural community, home to sprawling dairy farms, dirt roads, and families whose lives were dictated by the seasons and the harvest. For generations, the loudest sound echoing across these snow-dusted fields was the rumble of a distant freight train or the slow churn of a tractor. It was a place fundamentally disconnected from the geopolitical infernos raging across the Atlantic. Yet beneath the serene, frost-covered surface of this rural landscape, an industrial metamorphosis of unprecedented scale was about to unfold. As the shadow of the Second World War lengthened over Europe, the United States government realized that its traditional military arsenals were dangerously inadequate. The mechanized blitzkrieg tactics that had rapidly dismantled European defenses required a response in kind, a massive, overwhelming mobilization of armored vehicles. Washington recognized that the only force capable of producing complex machinery at such a staggering volume was the American automotive industry. The government turned its eyes toward Detroit, the undisputed manufacturing capital of the world, and specifically to General Motors. Within GM, the Fisher Body division, renowned for its precision engineering and mass production of automobile chassis, was handed an impossible mandate. They were asked to stop building passenger cars and start forging 30-ton monsters of steel. The task was daunting. A modern tank was not simply a heavy car. It was a mobile fortress requiring thick armored plating, massive turrets, and engineering tolerances that left no room for error. Existing factories were not equipped for the sheer weight and scale of such production. A completely new, purpose-built facility was required. After surveying multiple locations, General Motors and government planners settled on a vast tract of farmland in Grand Blanc. The location was strategic. It offered hundreds of acres of open land necessary for a colossal building footprint and a private tank testing ground, while remaining closely connected to the deep industrial supply chains and railway networks of nearby Flint and Detroit. In November 1941, the first fleets of heavy earth movers and bulldozers arrived in Grand Blanc, tearing into the frozen topsoil. The initial construction schedule was already incredibly aggressive, driven by the looming threat of global conflict. But on the morning of December 7, 1941, everything changed. The attack on Pearl Harbor shattered the illusion of American isolationism. the nation was suddenly at war, and the timeline for the Grand Blanc plant evaporated from an urgent priority to a matter of desperate national survival. Through one of the harshest Michigan winters in recent memory, construction crews worked around the clock in brutal, freezing conditions. Powerful floodlights illuminated the muddy, snow-swept construction site 24 hours a day, casting long shadows as thousands of laborers poured concrete and welded structural steel. They fought against blizzards, freezing temperatures that threatened to ruin the concrete foundation, and the constant crushing pressure of a wartime deadline. Yet the framework of an industrial titan began to rise against the gray winter sky. The sheer scale of the undertaking was difficult for the local residents to comprehend. Where dairy cattle had grazed just months prior, a sprawling 452,000 square foot manufacturing complex was taking shape. The architecture was utilitarian, heavy, and imposing, designed not for aesthetics, but to withstand the immense internal forces of heavy industrial manufacturing. Massive overhead cranes, capable of lifting entire tank hulls, were installed into the reinforced steel rafters. Deep concrete pits were excavated to house the heavy machinery needed to stamp and shape armored plating. By early 1942, an absolute miracle of American engineering and labor had been achieved. In a fraction of the time it would normally take to plan and build a facility of this magnitude, the Grand Blanc Tank Plant was structurally complete and ready for its internal tooling. The rural silence of the community had been permanently shattered. Freight trains now rumbled continuously down the newly laid spur tracks, delivering thousands of tons of raw steel, heavy machinery, and vital components. Simultaneously, a massive demographic shift occurred. As the factory doors prepared to open, thousands of workers descended upon the small town. They came from the automotive assembly lines of Flint, from the struggling farms of the Midwest, and from across the country, drawn by the call of wartime duty and the promise of steady wages. Men and women alike walked through the newly erected gates, ready to learn the dangerous and demanding trade of building war machines. The winter of 1941 to 1942 marked the permanent awakening of Grand Blanc. It was no longer just a farming community. It had been drafted into service as a vital organ in the arsenal of democracy. The stage was set, the massive electrical grids were powered up, and the heavy doors were unlocked. The quiet fields had been transformed into an industrial fortress, standing ready to forge the weapons that would soon dictate the fate of the free world. The true test, however, was only just beginning as the first raw steel rolled onto the assembly floor. By the spring of 1942, the freezing mud of the Michigan construction site had solidified into the concrete floor of the free world's newest and most formidable armory. The Grand Blanc Tank Plant was no longer a hastily drawn blueprint. It was a living, breathing, mechanical behemoth. Walking onto the production floor was an absolute assault on the senses. The cavernous air was thick with the acrid blue smoke of industrial welding and the heavy metallic scent of machine oil. The noise was a physical force, a relentless, deafening cacophony of drop hammers, grinding steel, and the synchronized shouting of foremen struggling to be heard over the industrial din. This was the Fisher Body Division, doing what it did best, but on a scale that defied all previous comprehension. General Motors had successfully transplanted the DNA of the automotive moving assembly line into the brutal calculus of mechanized warfare. At the center of this organized chaos was the M4 Sherman tank. Before Grand Blanc, tanks were often built in small batches, pieced together in specialized workshops like bespoke, deadly vehicles. The new facility changed the global paradigm entirely. Here, 30-ton monsters of steel were birthed in a continuous, flowing process. Giant overhead cranes hoisted massive cast steel hulls into place as if they were hollow toys. As the chassis moved slowly down the line, a synchronized army of workers descended upon it. They dropped in massive radial engines, secured complex transmission assemblies, and lowered the heavy, rotating turrets onto their iron rings. It was an industrial ballet choreographed by desperation and driven by patriotism. The factory's unique layout allowed raw materials to enter at one end and fully functional, battle-ready war machines to roll out the other, straight onto waiting flatbed rail cars destined for the ports of the East Coast. But the true heartbeat of the Grand Blanc Tank Plant was not its machinery. It was the people who operated it. The insatiable demands of the global conflict had severely drained the traditional male workforce, pulling young men from the factory floors to the front lines. To fill the gaping void, the demographics of American manufacturing shifted practically overnight. Women, many of whom had never set foot inside a heavy industrial facility, answered the call in the thousands. They strapped on heavy leather aprons, pulled down protective welding masks, and picked up heavy riveting guns. They became the vital backbone of the arsenal of democracy. Former shop clerks, farmhands, and housewives were suddenly tasked with executing precision welds on inch-thick armor plating, welds that absolutely had to hold together when struck by German artillery shells across the Atlantic. They worked grueling, 12-hour shifts, often 6 or 7 days a week, fueled by the stark realization that the lives of American soldiers depended directly on the quality of their daily labor. As the war raged on, the battlefield reality in Europe shifted, and the plant had to pivot. Reports from the front lines indicated that the highly reliable Sherman was being outgunned by heavier, more heavily armored German tanks like the Panther and the Tiger. The military demanded a rapid response, and Grand Blanc delivered. The plant's engineers and floor workers executed a staggering feat of industrial agility, retooling the massive assembly lines to produce the M26 Pershing, a heavier, wider tank with a devastating 90mm gun and significantly thicker armor. Switching production lines for passenger cars usually took months of careful planning and downtime. Doing it for heavy tanks in the middle of a global war was a logistical miracle. Yet the workers adapted, wrestling with larger components and tighter tolerances without ever letting the assembly lines stop. By 1945, the factory had reached a crescendo of productivity that permanently cemented its legendary status in military history. The output numbers were staggering. From the moment the first tank rolled off the line to the final days of the conflict, the workers at Grand Blanc forged over 11,000 armored vehicles. If lined up bumper to bumper, this steel armada would stretch for miles. They had built enough armor to equip entire armies, single-handedly outproducing the combined industrial output of several Axis nations. The facility had fulfilled its mandate flawlessly, transforming a quiet Michigan farming community into one of the most critical military-industrial nodes on the planet. But the very success of the Grand Blanc Tank Plant carried the seeds of an inevitable and immediate crisis. In August 1945, the devastating atomic conclusions in the Pacific brought the Second World War to a sudden, dramatic end. Across the nation, people flooded the streets in jubilation. But inside the cavernous walls of the Fisher body plant, the news brought a complex mixture of immense relief and profound anxiety. The government, suddenly lacking enemies to fight, instantly canceled billions of dollars in military contracts. Within weeks, the deafening roar of the assembly lines began to falter. The massive moving tracks slowed, then stopped completely. The relentless influx of raw steel dried up. The thousands of men and women who had poured their sweat and sanity into building the arsenal were suddenly handed pink slips, their patriotic duty fulfilled, but their economic futures entirely uncertain. The colossal facility, built specifically to feed a war that no longer existed, was left echoing in a profound, unsettling silence. The first peak had been conquered, but the free fall was immediate. The profound silence that settled over the Grand Blanc Tank Plant in the autumn of 1945 was as heavy as the armored steel it had once forged. The vast 452,000 square foot facility, which had thrummed with the frantic, deafening energy of global salvation just weeks prior, now stood practically empty. Its immense overhead cranes hung motionless in the dimming light, and the deep concrete pits were swept clean of metal shavings. For the thousands of workers who had poured their sweat into the assembly lines, the sudden halt was a severe economic whiplash. The United States government no longer needed a relentless river of war machines, and without a war, the plant had no core purpose. General Motors, faced with a colossal, empty building, relegated the facility to the most mundane of tasks. The arsenal of democracy was unceremoniously converted into a glorified storage warehouse for the nearby Buick Automotive Division. Stacks of civilian car bumpers, wooden crates, and spare tires occupied the spaces where heavy gun turrets had once been bolted to 30-ton chassis. It was a quiet, humiliating purgatory for a facility explicitly built for industrial titanism. However, the geopolitical peace proved to be a fragile, fleeting illusion. By 1950, the Iron Curtain had descended firmly across Europe, and the first violent shots of the Korean War echoed across the 38th parallel. The sudden outbreak of hostility on the Korean peninsula, backed by the looming nuclear-armed shadow of the Soviet Union, sent shockwaves through Washington. The United States military quickly realized that its rapid post-World War II disarmament had been a dangerous miscalculation. The aging fleet of 1940s-era armor was outmatched, and a new generation of sophisticated heavy tanks was desperately required to counter communist forces. The Pentagon once again picked up the phone, and the call went straight back to General Motors and the dormant giants of Grand Blanc. The pivot was violent and immediate. The Buick spare parts were hastily cleared out, and the factory floor was radically reconfigured for a new era of mechanized conflict. The government tasked the plant with producing the M48 Patton, a formidable, state-of-the-art medium tank designed specifically to counter Soviet aggression. The M48 was heavier, more heavily armored, and vastly more complex than anything Grand Blanc had produced during the Second World War. It featured a massive 90mm main gun, a newly designed precision suspension system, and an intricately cast elliptical hull intended to deflect advanced anti-tank munitions. The reawakening of the plant brought a wave of economic relief back to the community. The sprawling parking lots filled once again, and the familiar, deafening roar of industrial production returned to Genesee County. Many of the veteran workers from the 1940s returned to the lines, their faces a little older, but their hands just as steady. They were joined by a new generation of welders, machinists, and assemblers, all united by a renewed sense of urgency. Over the next 5 years, the facility operated at a blistering pace, churning out an impressive armada of over 4,200 M48 Patton tanks. These machines rolled off the Grand Blanc assembly lines and directly into the tense, freezing battlefields of Korea, as well as onto the heavily fortified borders of West Germany, standing as the frontline deterrent against a potential Soviet invasion of Western Europe. Yet even as the production numbers soared and the facility proved its worth a second time, an invisible, strategic shift was quietly rendering the plant's core purpose obsolete. By the mid-1950s, the doctrine of global warfare was fundamentally transforming. The advent of thermonuclear weapons, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and advanced supersonic bombers shifted the Pentagon's focus away from massive, land-based armored engagements. The military-industrial complex was redirecting its vast resources toward the skies and the edge of space. The government realized it no longer needed to maintain a colossal, dedicated tank manufacturing facility operating at full capacity in Michigan. In 1955, making kikat, the fatal decree was handed down. Tank production at the Grand Blanc facility would be terminated. This time, there would be no temporary pause, no warehousing phase, remass waiting for the next conventional conflict. The United States government was officially pulling its military vehicle contracts from the plant for good. For the second time in a decade, the massive assembly lines ground to a halt. But this shutdown carried a far more existential dread for the thousands of workers clocking out. The facility was entirely specialized for military heavy manufacturing. Its electrical grids, its foundation weight limits, and its internal architecture were all engineered around moving 30 and 40-ton pieces of solid steel. It was a machine built exclusively to build machines of war. With the military permanently walking away, the Grand Blanc Tank Plant was plunged into a desperate crisis. It faced a stark and brutal ultimatum from corporate headquarters: execute a massive, prohibitively expensive structural metamorphosis to serve the civilian consumer market, or shut its doors forever, leaving its workforce stranded in the economic wreckage of the Cold War. The era of the tank was over, and the facility's fight for its own survival had just begun. In 1955, the Grand Blanc facility stood on the precipice of oblivion. The military had permanently severed its contracts, and the massive concrete floors were once again enveloped in a chilling silence. General Motors faced a critical crossroads: permanently shutter the sprawling complex and lay off thousands of loyal workers, or engineer a radical multi-million-dollar metamorphosis to adapt the factory for the booming post-war civilian economy. The mid-1950s marked the dawn of the golden age of the American automobile. The nation was obsessed with speed, freedom, and the open highway. Consumers demanded larger, heavier, and more elaborately designed cars adorned with sweeping tail fins and acres of gleaming chrome. To feed this insatiable market, GM's Fisher Body division required an unprecedented volume of precisely molded steel. The corporation looked at the empty, reinforced shell of the Grand Blanc Tank Plant and made a decisive gamble. It would not be abandoned. It would be reborn as the mechanical heart of GM's domestic empire. The transformation from an arsenal to a civilian manufacturing hub was an engineering spectacle. The remnants of heavy tank production, the turret rings, the armor plating jigs, and the heavy artillery hoists were ruthlessly ripped out and scrapped. In their place, contractors poured deeper, more heavily reinforced concrete foundations, preparing the earth to support a new kind of industrial monster: the mechanical stamping press. These presses were architectural marvels in their own right, towering machines that stood stories high and extended deep into subterranean pits. They were designed to take flat, heavy sheets of raw steel and smash them into complex aerodynamic shapes: hoods, fenders, doors, and roof panels in a single, violent motion. When the newly christened Grand Blanc stamping plant finally powered up its new lines, the sensory experience of the factory was fundamentally altered. The chaotic, grinding cacophony of tank assembly was replaced by a synchronized, rhythmic, and terrifyingly powerful mechanical heartbeat. When a line of major stamping presses cycled in unison, the impact generated thousands of tons of blunt force. The ground physically shuddered. The deep, concussive thuds reverberated through the soles of the workers' boots and echoed across the surrounding town. It was the undeniable sound of American economic supremacy. This rebirth triggered a massive physical expansion. Over the ensuing years, the footprint of the facility ballooned outward, swallowing up more of the surrounding fields until it reached a staggering 1.6 million square feet of covered manufacturing space. It became a sprawling, self-contained industrial city. The workforce swelled once again, not with wartime draftees, but with career auto workers. Under the powerful banner of the United Auto Workers Union, the men and women operating these massive presses secured wages, health care, and pensions that defined the peak of the American middle class. A job at the Grand Blanc stamping plant meant purchasing a home, sending children to college, and perhaps buying a cabin by a Michigan lake. The factory had successfully cheated death, trading the volatile business of warfare for the seemingly infinite prosperity of the open road. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Grand Blanc stamping plant had ascended to its absolute zenith. It was an indispensable node in the vast, globe-spanning General Motors empire. Trainloads of heavy coil steel rolled into the loading docks continuously, and an endless river of perfectly stamped body panels flowed out, destined for assembly plants in Flint, Detroit, and across the nation. The facility operated around the clock in 3 brutal, high-intensity shifts. The parking lots were oceans of gleaming Detroit-built steel, and the internal culture of the plant thrived. It had its own cafeterias, internal newsletters, sports leagues, and an intricate social hierarchy. To the outside observer, and indeed to the executives sitting in the distant boardroom of the GM building in Detroit, the stamping colossus appeared utterly invincible. However, beneath the surface of this historic peak, a slow and invisible rot was beginning to take hold. The very success of the Grand Blanc facility and of General Motors as a whole bred a dangerous and pervasive corporate arrogance. The prevailing philosophy of the era was notoriously summarized as, "What is good for General Motors is good for the country." This supreme confidence fostered a culture of complacency. The massive stamping presses at Grand Blanc were a marvel of mid-century engineering, but they were incredibly rigid. They were optimized for one specific philosophy: high-volume, high-speed production of large, heavy, uniquely American car parts. Retooling these giant dies for new, innovative designs was an expensive, agonizingly slow process that management was increasingly reluctant to undertake. The first major tremors of the impending collapse arrived with the oil crisis of 1973. Overnight, the American consumer's appetite for massive, fuel-thirsty V8 sedans evaporated. Long lines at the gas pumps sparked a sudden, desperate demand for smaller, lighter, and more fuel-efficient vehicles. Suddenly, the Japanese and European automakers, who had spent decades quietly perfecting lean, agile, and efficient manufacturing systems, aggressively entered the American market. General Motors was caught entirely off guard. The giant of Grand Blanc, perfectly engineered to stamp out massive steel hoods for Chevrolet Impalas and Buick Electras, could not easily or cheaply pivot to producing lightweight components for compact cars. The corporate bloat, the layers of middle management, and the increasingly tense adversarial relationship between the executives and the powerful labor unions paralyzed the company's ability to adapt. As the 1970s bled into the 1980s, the once unstoppable flow of orders began to slow. The deafening, rhythmic thud of the presses, the heartbeat of the local economy, began to skip beats. Foreign competition was no longer a distant nuisance. It was an existential threat pulling up right to the factory gates. The seeds of destruction, planted during the height of the facility's greatest arrogance, were finally beginning to sprout, setting the stage for a prolonged and painful era of decline. The dawn of the 1980s brought a cold, unforgiving reality to the American Midwest. The economic tremors that had begun in the 1970s with the oil embargoes were no longer temporary disruptions. They had solidified into a permanent structural shift in the global automotive landscape. The American consumer had changed. Stung by volatile gas prices and frustrated by declining domestic reliability, buyers were turning away from the massive, heavy sedans that Detroit had built its empire upon. Instead, they were flocking to showrooms, selling Hondas, Toyotas, and Nissans. These foreign competitors offered vehicles that were smaller, remarkably fuel efficient, and manufactured with a lean, precise efficiency that the bloated American auto industry simply could not match. Inside the Grand Blanc stamping plant, this global shift manifested as a creeping, existential dread. The colossal stamping presses, which had once violently formed the sweeping steel curves of the 1960s golden era, were now struggling to adapt to the tight, economical designs required for the new decade. But the mechanical challenges were entirely overshadowed by a profound crisis of identity that was about to strike the very heart of the workforce. Since its inception, the Grand Blanc facility had operated under the banner of the Fisher Body Division. Within the vast, often chaotic hierarchy of General Motors, Fisher Body was a legendary institution. Originally an independent coach builder founded by the Fisher brothers in the early 20th century, it had been fully absorbed by GM, but had fiercely maintained its own distinct culture, management style, and intense pride. The Body by Fisher emblem, featuring a classic Napoleonic carriage, was affixed to the door sills of millions of vehicles, symbolizing a standard of craftsmanship that the workers at Grand Blanc took immense personal pride in. They didn't just work for GM, they were Fisher Body men and women. However, in the mid-1980s, the executive leadership at General Motors, spearheaded by Chairman Roger Smith, looked at the company's plummeting market share and decided that drastic corporate restructuring was the only path to survival. The deeply entrenched semi-autonomous divisions like Fisher Body were viewed by the Detroit boardroom not as assets of quality, but as layers of redundant bureaucracy that were slowing the company down and bleeding profits. In 1986, the fatal blow was struck. General Motors officially dissolved the Fisher Body division. After nearly 7 decades of defining American automotive craftsmanship, the legendary mark was completely wiped from the corporate ledger. At Grand Blanc, the psychological impact was devastating. The iconic Body by Fisher signs were unceremoniously pulled down from the factory facades. Decades of institutional memory, fierce divisional loyalty, and a deeply ingrained culture of quality were erased by a single boardroom decree. The workers were no longer part of an elite guild of coach builders. They were simply numerical assets in a struggling, monolithic corporation trying to stop the bleeding. Stripped of its foundational identity, the Grand Blanc facility was thrown into a dizzying era of corporate musical chairs. Without the protective umbrella of Fisher Body, the massive 1.6 million square foot plant became a pawn in General Motors' frantic attempts to reorganize itself back to profitability. Over the next decade, the facility was bounced from one newly invented corporate group to another. First, it was absorbed into the unwieldy Buick Oldsmobile Cadillac, BOC Group. When that structure failed to yield the desired efficiencies, the plant was shifted under the Cadillac/luxury car division, and later, the grandly titled but creatively bankrupt metal fabricating division. With every change of the sign on the front gate came a new wave of middle management, a new set of contradictory production philosophies, and a renewed mandate to ruthlessly cut costs. The boardroom had realized that they could not easily out-innovate their foreign rivals, so they decided they had to out-cut them. The era of the blank check was over. The era of the spreadsheet had arrived. This relentless drive for efficiency ushered in the most terrifying threat the workers had ever faced: automation. To compete with the hyper-efficient Japanese factories, GM began investing heavily in robotics. Inside Grand Blanc, the dark, oily aisles where hundreds of men and women used to wrestle heavy steel panels into welding jigs were suddenly occupied by towering, orange mechanical arms. These robots did not require pensions, they did not take breaks, and they did not belong to the United Auto Workers Union. While automation was undeniably necessary to keep the company globally competitive, It directly severed the livelihood of the local community. The consequences were immediate and painful. The late 1980s and early 1990s witnessed the first major waves of permanent layoffs. The parking lots, which once required careful navigation to find a spot across 3 bustling shifts, began to show expansive, empty patches of faded asphalt. Inside the plant, the atmosphere grew tense and bitter. The powerful camaraderie that had defined the Fisher Body days was replaced by a pervasive paranoia. Workers with decades of seniority watched nervously as the lines they had operated for years were dismantled or automated. The union halls in Genesee County, once the sites of triumphant rallies and powerful contract negotiations, transformed into somber centers of crisis management. Local leaders fought desperately to save jobs, but they were negotiating against an inevitable tide of technological advancement and corporate desperation. The Grand Blanc stamping plant was surviving, but it was surviving by cannibalizing its own workforce. The colossal facility was slowly rusting from the inside out. It was no longer a symbol of limitless American prosperity. It had become a grim battlefield where human loyalty and historical legacy were locked in a losing war against automation and the merciless demands of a globalized economy. As the new millennium dawned, the sprawling complex in Grand Blanc underwent a final, humiliating metamorphosis. It was officially stripped of its manufacturing soul and rechristened the Grand Blanc Weld Tool Center. The title was clinical, precise, and profoundly tragic. General Motors had determined that the colossal facility was no longer economically viable as a primary stamping plant. The massive mechanical presses, the very heartbeat that had thumped rhythmically through the floorboards of Genesee County for nearly half a century, were deemed obsolete or redundant in the face of leaner, globally distributed supply chains. The dismantling of the stamping colossus was an arduous, sobering spectacle. One by one, the towering iron titans were unbolted from their deep concrete moorings. Cranes that had once hoisted 30-ton tank turrets were now used to tear the factory's own organs out. The presses were disassembled and either shipped off to newer, more efficient facilities or sold as crude scrap metal. The physical removal of these machines left behind a landscape that defied comprehension. The factory spanned an unfathomable 1.6 million square feet, a cavernous, enclosed universe of steel girders and concrete, but it was now fundamentally hollow. Walking onto the floor in the early 2000s was akin to stepping into a desecrated cathedral of industry. The deep subterranean pits that once housed the violent kinetic energy of the stamping machines were cordoned off or filled in, leaving vast, eerie expanses of empty, oil-stained floor space. Where thousands of auto workers once bustled in a synchronized, chaotic ballet of mass production, a profound and unsettling silence had taken root. The workforce was brutally decimated. From the proud thousands who had once jammed the local highways at the shift change, the roster slowly bled out until only about 400 employees remained. These men and women were not unskilled laborers. They were elite, highly specialized tradespeople, tool and die makers, skilled welders, and master machinists. Their new mandate was to build and repair the robotic welding equipment and tooling jigs used by other GM plants. It was vital, intricate work. But it required only a microscopic fraction of the facility's immense footprint. To the workers left behind, the Grand Blanc plant had transformed from a bustling industrial citadel into a sprawling, metallic ghost town. The sheer scale of the emptiness was psychologically oppressive. The space was so vast and underpopulated that employees began using bicycles and electric golf carts just to traverse the dark, unlit sections of the factory floor, to reach the small, isolated islands of activity where the lights were still humming. They were working in the skeletal remains of a leviathan, surrounded every day by the haunting, echoing ghosts of their own industrial past. This purgatorial twilight existence was abruptly shattered by the global financial collapse of 2008. The American automotive industry, already reeling from decades of foreign competition, corporate mismanagement, and staggering legacy costs, was pushed to the absolute brink of total annihilation. General Motors, the once invincible titan of global capitalism, found itself hemorrhaging billions of dollars in cash, entirely unable to pay its suppliers, service its colossal debt, or sustain its sprawling network of underutilized, aging factories. In the early summer of 2009, the unthinkable became a stark reality. General Motors officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy reorganization. It was the largest industrial bankruptcy in United States history, a catastrophic financial event that sent a shockwave of terror through every community tethered to the automaker. For the 400 remaining workers at the Grand Blanc Weld Tool Center, the news was a localized apocalypse. They gathered in the sparsely populated break rooms, their eyes glued to small television screens as the federal government essentially took control of their employer. Their livelihoods were no longer in the hands of their immediate supervisors or even the executives in Detroit. They were entirely at the mercy of federal task forces and bankruptcy judges tasked with ruthlessly carving out the diseased portions of the corporate body. During the chaotic, fiercely debated restructuring process, General Motors was surgically split into two distinct entities. The profitable brands and modern assets were placed into a new, federally backed company known as New GM, while the toxic, unwanted liabilities, including dozens of outdated factories, contaminated land, and unpayable debts across the Rust Belt, were dumped into an entity called the Motors Liquidation Company. Every single day, the workers in Grand Blanc arrived at their isolated stations, navigating the dark, echoing corridors of the plant, carrying the excruciating tension of waiting for the corporate guillotine to fall. The facility was an obvious target on the balance sheet. Heating, maintaining, and paying property taxes on a 1.6 million square foot building to house merely 400 workers was a masterclass in corporate inefficiency. Miraculously, by a stroke of logistical necessity, the Grand Blanc facility initially survived the massive 2009 purge. The highly specialized, irreplaceable skills of its remaining toolmakers were deemed temporarily necessary to support the launch of a new generation of vehicles that GM desperately needed to orchestrate its miraculous comeback. But no one on the floor was under any illusion. This reprieve was universally understood to be a temporary, fragile stay of execution. The factory was a decaying relic of a bygone era, the mythical aura of the arsenal of democracy, the history of Sherman tanks, and the golden age of the Fisher body era offered absolutely no protection against the cold, unfeeling arithmetic of modern corporate restructuring. The plant had been entirely hollowed out, its original purpose stripped away, and its legacy mortgaged to pay off the sins of the past. It was merely lingering on life support, a ghostly colossus standing quietly in the Michigan winter, waiting inevitably for the executives in Detroit to finally pull the plug. The fragile reprieve granted during General Motors' historic bankruptcy restructuring could only last so long. As the corporation stabilized and began to aggressively look toward a leaner, highly centralized future, the massive, drastically underutilized footprint in Grand Blanc became impossible to justify to Wall Street. The final, fatal blow did not arrive with the dramatic urgency of a wartime telegram, nor did it come with the roaring chaos of a sudden economic crash. It came as a sterile, calculated corporate memo. In January 2013, General Motors officially announced the impending permanent closure of the Grand Blanc Weld Tool Center. After 71 uninterrupted years of manufacturing everything from heavy battlefield armor to the intricate tooling of the modern automotive age, the facility's legendary run was officially over. The boardroom logic was unassailable from a purely financial perspective. GM executives had determined that the company could save critical capital by consolidating its remaining regional tool and die operations into a single, more modern facility located in Parma, Ohio. The cold arithmetic of 21st century manufacturing dictated that keeping a sprawling 1.6 million square foot fortress open to house just over 300 remaining employees was a gross inefficiency that could no longer be tolerated. But to the men and women standing on the factory floor, this calculation was perceived as a profound, deeply personal betrayal. Many of these workers had spent their entire adult lives inside those thick concrete walls. They were second, sometimes third-generation Fisher body employees who had survived the chaotic corporate reorganizations of the 1980s, outlasted the aggressive automation waves of the 1990s, and endured the terrifying, existential uncertainty of the 2009 bankruptcy. They had sacrificed their physical health and their peace of mind to keep the lines running through the company's darkest hours. Now they were being ordered to pack up the very tooling equipment they had meticulously maintained for decades and ship it out of state. The 6 months spanning between the closure announcement and the final shift were an agonizing, surreal period of forced dismantling. The remaining workers were essentially tasked with digging their own industrial graves. It was an incredibly bitter assignment, tearing apart the intricate robotic welding cells, unbolting the heavy precision machinery, and crating it all up in heavy wood to prepare for transport to the very facility in Ohio that was absorbing their livelihoods. The sprawling plant, already achingly empty, grew even more cavernous and ghostly as vital equipment was loaded onto endless lines of flatbed trucks. The ambient noise of the factory, a comforting, low-frequency hum that had been a constant companion to the surrounding town since the freezing winter of 1941, began to incrementally fade away. Every removed machine left behind a remarkably clean, oil-free rectangle on the dirty concrete floor, a glaring, unavoidable visual reminder of exactly what was being lost. The camaraderie among the final skeleton crew deepened into a shared, quiet mourning. During their breaks, they traded stories of the old days, of the deafening, earth-shaking stamping presses and the thousands of cars that used to jam the parking lot, desperately preserving the oral history of a place that the corporate ledger had already written off. Then came the morning of July 1st, 2013, the final shift. There were no marching bands, no speeches from high-ranking Detroit executives, and no grand ceremonies to honor the end of an era that had fundamentally shaped the global century. The weather outside was typical for a Michigan summer, but inside the heavy steel doors, the atmosphere was thick with an indescribable, suffocating finality. The remaining crew clocked in for the absolute last time, swiping their badges and walking past the exact same security hem gates their grandfathers might have passed through during the frantic height of the Second World War. The tasks for the day were entirely minimal. There were no more production quotas to meet, no more emergency repairs to execute, and no future models to prepare for. The singular focus was on shutting down the remaining infrastructure safely. Highly skilled technicians moved methodically through the designated zones, executing the final shutdown protocols. The sharp hiss of compressed air lines being bled dry echoed sharply against the distant empty walls. Massive electrical sub-panels were switched off one by one, plunging large, historic swathes of the facility into a permanent, unbroken darkness. The sensory experience of the plant's death was deeply unsettling to witness. A factory of this magnificent scale is akin to a living organism. It breathes through its massive ventilation systems. It vibrates constantly with high-voltage electrical current, and it communicates through the rhythmic, mechanical cycling of machinery. As the veteran workers walked down the desolate lines, pulling the heavy, industrial disconnect switches, They were essentially stopping that heartbeat. By the late afternoon, the final robotic welding cell was formally powered down. The heavy hydraulic pump spun to a halt, letting out a long mechanical sigh before falling completely, irreversibly, silent. The quiet that followed was absolute and terrifying. It was not the temporary, restful quiet of a weekend or a holiday shutdown. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of extinction. The men and women gathered in the locker rooms one last time. The metallic slam of locker doors echoing down the halls sounded like vault doors sealing shut. They gathered their personal toolboxes, heavy rolling metal chests covered in decades of faded union stickers, grease stains, and family photographs. They swept their immediate work areas one last time, a final, poignant act of ingrained professional pride. As they walked out of the massive bay doors and stepped into the bright afternoon sun, many stopped to take a final, lingering look back into the cavernous, darkening space that had defined their lives. They shook hands, shared brief, emotional embraces with colleagues they had known for decades, and quietly walked to their vehicles. The heavy perimeter gates were drawn shut, and a heavy steel padlock was snapped into place. With that sharp metallic click, the grand Blanc Tank Plant, the proud arsenal of democracy, the mighty stamping colossus, the mechanical heart of an entire community, ceased to exist as a place of industry. The last shift had ended, leaving behind nothing but 1.6 million square feet of memories and the looming, uncomfortable question of what the world would do with the colossal, empty shell they had just left behind. The heavy steel padlock snapping shut on the main gate in July 2013 marked the cessation of human labor, but it was not the final chapter of the Grand Blanc facility's physical ordeal. The true death of an industrial giant is rarely just a quiet abandonment. It is a violent, systematic erasure. In the immediate aftermath of the shutdown, the sprawling 1.6 million square foot complex sat in a state of suspended animation. It was a massive, silent tomb looming over Genesee County. But behind closed corporate doors, the calculus of its ultimate fate was already being finalized. The property had been transferred to a specialized liquidation trust created during General Motors' bankruptcy proceedings, tasked with managing, cleaning, and selling off the toxic, discarded assets of the old corporate empire. The stark reality was that no modern manufacturer wanted or could afford a gargantuan, aging behemoth designed for a bygone era of production. Furthermore, 71 uninterrupted years of heavy, relentless industry had left deep, invisible scars. The subterranean pits and concrete foundations were laced with decades of industrial lubricants, chemical solvents, heavy metals, and asbestos. The building was not a real estate asset. It was a colossal environmental and financial liability. The final verdict was inevitable. To salvage any value from the land, the arsenal of democracy had to be completely leveled. In early 2014, a new fleet of heavy machinery arrived at the gates of Grand Blanc. There was a dark, bitter irony in their appearance. These were not the bulldozers and cranes of 1941, driven by a desperate patriotic fervor to build a fortress that would save the free world. These were towering hydraulic excavators equipped with massive steel shears and concrete pulverizers, brought in by private contractors to execute a cold, transactional demolition. The very type of heavy steel tracks and powerful diesel engines that the plant's workers had spent decades perfecting were now crawling across the parking lots to tear their legacy to the ground. The systematic dismantling of a structure built to withstand the immense internal pressures of heavy tank manufacturing was a staggering undertaking. It began from the inside out. Environmental remediation teams in full hazmat suits meticulously stripped away thousands of tons of asbestos insulation and hazardous materials. Once the toxic skeleton was picked clean, The heavy demolition machines moved in to break the bones. The physical destruction was a visceral, deeply unsettling spectacle for the surrounding community. The colossal corrugated metal walls, which had shielded the secret production of the Sherman and Pershing tanks, were peeled away like foil. Massive hydraulic shears snapped the thick, reinforced steel I-beams that once supported the weight of 30-ton turrets, the sharp cracks echoing for miles like artillery fire. Huge sections of the roof were deliberately collapsed, sending massive, suffocating plumes of gray dust drifting over the nearby residential streets and commercial strip malls. For the former workers, watching the demolition was an agonizing form of psychological closure. Many of the men and women who had spent their entire adult lives inside those walls found themselves instinctively driving past the site, pulling their cars over onto the shoulders of Saginaw Street. They stood behind temporary chain-link fences, leaning against the hoods of their cars, watching in silence as the physical anchor of their history was literally chewed to pieces. They saw the specific corners where they had eaten their lunches, the bays where they had celebrated retirements, and the sprawling floors where they had forged lifelong friendships, all reduced to twisted metal and jagged concrete. It took less than a year for demolition crews to destroy what had taken a miraculous, Herculean effort to build during the freezing winter of 1941. The ease and speed of the destruction felt like an insult to the permanence the building had once represented. The most profound, symbolic decapitation of the facility came with the felling of the factory's towering water tower. For over half a century, the massive steel structure bearing the faded, unmistakable logo of General Motors had dominated the Grand Blanc skyline. It was the visual heartbeat of the town, a landmark that guided travelers and reassured residents that the colossal economic engine of their community was still standing watch. When the demolition crews finally cut the tower's legs, it groaned and toppled to the earth with a thunderous, earth-shaking crash. A dense cloud of dirt and rust billowed into the air, and when it finally cleared, the horizon was permanently altered. By the end of 2015, the structural skeletons were entirely gone. The deep, subterranean press pits that had once violently formed the sweeping curves of mid-century American automobiles were filled in with the pulverized remains of the factory's own concrete foundation. The land was aggressively scraped, graded, and flattened. Where a 1.6 million square foot titan of global manufacturing had stood just 2 years prior, there was now only a massive, unnatural void. The physical erasure was absolute and complete. The giant had not simply died. It had been wiped from the face of the earth, leaving behind a jarringly empty expanse of dirt that seemed far too quiet for a place that had once roared with the deafening sound of history. Today, if you drive down South Saginaw Street in Grand Blanc, Michigan, looking for the physical remnants of the arsenal of democracy, you will find nothing but a jarring, unremarkable expanse of asphalt and commercial development. The monumental 1.6 million square foot fortress of steel and concrete that once dominated the local horizon has been entirely replaced by a sterile, modern landscape. To the casual observer, or a commuter briefly stopping at a nearby intersection, the site offers absolutely no visual clues to its profound historical significance. There are no towering mechanical presses, no heavy freight trains rumbling with raw steel, and no deafening echoes of industrial labor. It is a quiet, highly sanitized space, often utilized as a modern logistics center or a sprawling commercial parking area. The physical erasure was executed with such chilling efficiency that it feels as though the factory was never really there at all, but rather a collective, vivid hallucination shared by the thousands of people who once punched its time clocks. It is profoundly unsettling to stand in the middle of this generic commercial zone and realize the sheer, staggering weight of the history buried directly beneath the new pavement. The drivers who casually park their vehicles here today are resting their tires on the exact coordinates where the fate of the Second World War was forged. Underneath the carefully painted white parking lines lie the filled-in remnants of the deep concrete pits that once birthed over 11,000 Sherman and Pershing tanks. This was the hallowed ground where farm boys and housewives transformed themselves into elite armorers, working frantically through freezing winters to supply American troops on the beaches of Normandy and the frozen ridges of Korea. It was the mechanical heart that decades later pumped millions of gleaming steel body panels into the golden era of the American highway. Yet, because the physical structure was so ruthlessly obliterated, the geography itself has been stripped of its memory. For the younger generations growing up in Genesee County, the Grand Blanc Tank Plant is no longer a tangible reality. It is rapidly fading into the realm of local folklore, a mythical story told by aging grandparents about a time when their town built machines that saved the free world. The complete life cycle and ultimate erasure of the Grand Blanc facility serves as a brutal, defining lesson in the unforgiving nature of modern industrial capitalism. It vividly illustrates a terrifying truth that communities across the American Rust Belt have been forced to learn the hard way. In the corporate boardroom, historical legacy holds absolutely no currency. A factory can be the pride of a nation. It can literally construct the tools of global liberation, and it can anchor the middle-class prosperity of an entire region for over 70 years. But to the architects of globalized finance, a manufacturing plant is never a monument. It is merely an asset on a balance sheet. When the geopolitical winds shift, when consumer tastes change, or when a corporate conglomerate like General Motors finds itself staring down the barrel of a catastrophic bankruptcy, all past sacrifices are immediately rendered irrelevant. Loyalty, patriotism, and generational craftsmanship cannot outweigh a negative quarterly earnings report. The facility was executed simply because the arithmetic of the 21st century demanded a leaner, cheaper footprint, and history was not allowed to stand in the way of optimization. But the true lingering cost of the plant's demise cannot be entirely quantified by lost production capacity or leveled acreage. The deepest wounds were inflicted upon the human fabric of the community. For the thousands of men and women who proudly identified as Fisher-body tradespeople, the factory was far more than a source of income. It was the epicenter of their social world, the foundation of their family's security, and the physical manifestation of their professional pride. When the gates were permanently padlocked and the water tower was brought crashing down, a vital piece of the town's collective soul was violently amputated. The surviving veterans of the assembly lines are now the final, living keepers of the plant's history. They gather in quiet local diners or quiet union halls, their numbers slowly dwindling with each passing year, trading stories of the deafening stamping presses and the camaraderie forged in the trenches of heavy industry. They carry a complex mixture of immense pride for what they accomplished and a deep, enduring bitterness for how easily their life's work was discarded and swept away by executives hundreds of miles away. The story of the Grand Blanc Tank Plant is ultimately a uniquely American tragedy of creation and destruction. It is the saga of a quiet, snow-swept farming community that was unexpectedly drafted into a global war, transformed overnight into an unstoppable industrial colossus, and then slowly bled dry by decades of corporate restructuring and economic shifts until it was returned violently to a barren plot of land. The giant has been erased. The roaring engines of the arsenal of democracy have been silenced permanently, and the once mighty stamping colossus has been reduced to dust. All that remains today is the empty lot, the quiet wind blowing across the Michigan plains, and the fading echoes of a time when the hands of ordinary people built an empire of steel that changed the world. The story of the Grand Blanc Tank Plant is more than just a footnote in the history of American manufacturing. It is a profound reflection on the fragile nature of industrial empires. We often assume that fortresses built to withstand the devastating pressures of global war are permanent fixtures of our landscape. But the truth is far more unsettling. The true vulnerability of these colossal entities does not come from foreign adversaries, physical decay, or technological impossibilities. It comes from the cold, detached arithmetic of the corporate ledger. When a community tethers its absolute prosperity and its deeply held identity to a single corporate entity, it makes a dangerous wager. The men and women of Fisher Body poured their lives, their health, and their professional pride into the concrete foundation of that facility. They were told they were the arsenal of democracy, the undisputed beating heart of the American middle class. But a corporation, no matter how iconic or historically significant, possesses no memory. It has no conscience, and it holds no loyalty. It only has shareholders, balance sheets, and quarterly earnings reports. When the math no longer made sense, 71 years of profound national service and generational sacrifice were erased with a single padlock and a fleet of demolition excavators. The empty commercial lot that now sits on South Saginaw Street is a stark monument to this modern reality. It reminds us that no matter what we build, no matter how massive, how essential, or how deeply intertwined with our national identity, it is ultimately temporary if it stands in the way of corporate optimization. The true legacy of Grand Blanc does not live on in the vanished steel or the flattened concrete. It survives only in the fading memories of the workers who once made the ground shake. Thank you for watching this chapter of industrial history. If you found this story compelling, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a comment below. Share your thoughts on the ruthless nature of corporate legacy, or tell us about the forgotten factories and industrial giants that used to define your own hometown. Until next time, keep looking past the empty lots and remember the titans that used to stand there.